Hello, everyone. This is going to be our lecture on evolutionary forces. This is going to be your asynchronous work on Monday after Hardy-Weinberg. This lecture is going to be pretty short, so we're also going to try to do a little bit more Hardy-Weinberg practice as well on asynchronous Monday to make sure you all get that before we start our first lab. Okay, so we are still on Unit 1, evolution. We're trying to figure out, is evolution progress? How can we reconstruct evolutionary history? Where does the first cell come from, et cetera, et cetera. But today's question in particular is going to be, how else do species evolve other than natural selection? We spent a long time just sort of like in our classes and both last year and this year studying the idea of natural selection, which is really important. It's one of the ways that evolution can happen, but there are several other ways. And so we're going to try to understand the other ways that species evolve other than natural selection. Here's, I think, a really helpful graphic in figuring out the things that contribute to evolution. So you have evolution here. Natural selection is one of the ways that we've studied a lot, which is survival and reproduction, survival of the fittest, that idea. There's also three other ones: gene flow, genetic drift, and sexual selection. All three of these things are also different ways that evolution could happen that aren't natural selection. And so we're going to look at each one of those things independently and figure out some examples that may help us understand this idea of the factors that contribute to evolution a little bit better. The first we're going to look at is gene flow. So gene flow means the transfer of alleles in and out of a population due to the movement of fertile individuals or their gametes. Gametes, again, are reproductive cells. So gametes are just the cells that reproduce in a population. But essentially, you can think of gene flow as immigration. What's happening here is that you have one population and another population, population A, population B, and their genes are moving from one population to the next. A way that this could happen is through pollination. We can see it pretty obviously in plants, but it can also happen pretty directly in the context of an organism migrating. So here you can see that there is a population of these black beetles that are all homozygous dominant. So they all have capital A as part of their alleles. This is their genotype. One of these little bugs can go over to this population, and that's really going to change the whole population overall. We can sort of imagine that one of these bugs, let's just say that this black bug over here mates with this one. If we did a quick Punnett square of what that would look like, you'd have a lowercase, and we could see this would actually lead to every single individual being heterozygous. And so then the population would just become more and more black overall. And so we can see here that it actually literally, quite literally changes the way that the population exists and can have bigger and lasting impacts. So evolution we will define as just the movement of alleles, a change in genetics, and gene flow accomplishes that through migration. This can be voluntary, so it could just be like an organism like this moving from one place to the next, or it can be involuntary. It can be caused by a speciation event, that something maybe like a geographic barrier exists and blocks off almost all of these guys except for one of them, and they have to go to a different area. And so that could also be one of the reasons that gene flow occurs. The next thing we're going to look at is this idea of genetic drift. Genetic drift. Genetic drift is when a chance event, this means random, it is a random chance event, causes a change in allele frequency. So this is when something can happen in a population. The example that we'll look at is, like, let's look at what would happen if we had a bag of gumballs. Half of them are lemon, half of them are lime. And without looking, you randomly take a few out. And in the first case, you took out a bunch of lemons versus limes. You draw 7 lemons versus limes. And then over time, your population will eventually grow to be more lime-like. And so this is not a result of fitness. So we can say it's not fitness. And that's important because this means it's not natural selection. It's not about whether your genes or your alleles give you an advantage. It's not fitness, but it's just a random event, a luck of the draw situation that made you a little bit better. So there's a few things that could cause this. And there's two basic types of genetic drift that we want to look at. The one is called the bottleneck effect. The bottleneck effect is a type of genetic drift, and it's caused by a sudden event that causes the population to decrease drastically and then randomly shifts the allele frequency. So you can think about this as, let's look at this example over here. In the beginning, you have an equal ratio of blue and red bugs. And then a bottleneck event happens where, like randomly, if you were just to swap this, you end up hitting these 4 blue bugs. It's not because you saw blue better, but just because it's like a random event. And so now the population, the ratio changes, and over time you'll end up with a population of this many of the bugs. So you'll end up with a larger population of red bugs than blue bugs because of the bottleneck effect, a decrease drastically due to a random chance event. Here's an example of the bottleneck effect that happened in the earliest 20th century. This is an organism called the eastern gray wolf, which was nearly hunted to extinction in the 20th century. And so right now, populations are starting to rebound, but they're extremely vulnerable. So one big problem of the population effect is that the surviving population has lower genetic variation. Now, this becomes an issue because if there was some sort of a disease that would occur, this gray wolf population is more likely to die because they don't have that unique genetic diversity that could allow them to survive. And so you don't have natural selection as effective in this instance because you have a genetically simplified population. So an effect of the bottleneck effect is a genetically simplified population, which reduces genetic variation. That's an important thing to remember. Okay. The next thing to know about is the founder effect. The founder effect is another example of genetic drift. And the founder effect is essentially when a few individuals become isolated from the larger population due to what we usually consider a geographic split, but this can also be voluntary. This smaller group establishes a new population whose gene pool is different than the source. So what we can see here is this is an island of a bunch of different types of butterflies. Some butterflies, just the orange one and some of the brown ones, move over to a different island. And then over time, on this new island, you're only going to have orange and brown butterflies. You're not going to see the white butterflies anymore because of the founder effect. You also have this example of something called Ellis Van Creveld syndrome. In Pennsylvania, we saw a group of Amish settlers that moved to a unique location. And those Amish people, they don't really mix with any other part of the population. And so for a long time, their population, which had no contact with the outside world, gained this allele for Ellis Van Creveld syndrome. And they actually ended up with a large population with hands like this because of the smaller gene pool. So this also results in a lower genetic variation, which has caused the changes in allele frequency that you see there. The last thing that we're going to look at is something called sexual selection, another way that we can get to evolution. So one is sexual selection is a little bit different than the idea of natural selection because it's not about whether the traits make you better at surviving, but just that there is competition that occurs between members of a population or within members of a population that can cause some issues. So the first type of sexual selection is called intra-sexual selection. Intra, like intramural. And this is when members of the same sex compete for mates. So what's happening here is that these two big elk or moose or whatever are competing with each other, and if they win, then they'll have access to the mate. It's actually quite interesting in this instance. Like sometimes you'll see these fights get so wild that like the other one will die, and there's like pictures of one of these elk with like a total other elk head, like a decaying elk carcass on their body, which is kind of gross, but it does happen. So the other thing that you can have is intersexual selection, where you can attract members of the opposite sex by doing something unique. And so this is what things like peacocks will do, or Bella moths in this instance. They select males that are larger, so the larger you are, the more likely you are to attract a mate. And so this is another thing where it doesn't necessarily help you survive, and we'll look at an example of that with peacocks or something like that. But in this instance, it's literally just it makes the other sex more desirable. So here's an example that we've looked at in the past called willow birds. These willow birds were manipulated. So we were trying to figure out, what does artificially lengthening the tail of a willow bird have to do with their ability to reproduce? So here's the control. Here's what a willow bird normally looks like. Or sorry, here's the normal one. Yeah. Unmanipulated. So nothing is happening to the bird. And then we actually have a second control factor here where the bird is totally, the tail is cut off, but replaced by a fake tail with the same length. And we saw that as a result, their average number of nests, or the amount that they reproduce, is about the same. So these two have the same number of nests. When you artificially shorten the willow bird, they don't reproduce as much. And then when you artificially lengthen, it does reproduce a lot, which is really interesting and very cool, because it shows us that just the factor of having this tail it makes it more likely to mate. Now, one issue that we have with this is that the tail is actually not helpful for them. It's in fact quite harmful, because it's easy for predators to see the willow birds with a longer tail, but females still like them. And that's weird, right? Like, it's weird because if our idea of natural selection is true, the fact that we got this long tail and it makes you more vulnerable to predators would make you less likely to reproduce. And so the question is, why does that happen? And the answer is the idea of the handicap hypothesis. So the handicap hypothesis is the idea that males of a population, and sometimes females as well, will actually do things that make them more likely to stand out to predators. So for example, the willow bird has a long tail, and the peacock has this giant plume full of feathers, and this particular finch has this orange, very distinct orange marking on their faces. The handicap hypothesis says that if the male is still able to survive, despite the fact that it has this big handicap or this huge burden, then it's a good mate, because it proves that despite the fact that they got this huge tail that might make them die, they're still able to live in their environment and thrive. And so it's an example of a way that sexual selection can operate that's sort of outside of our normal framework for natural selection. And so this is it. This is the different ways that evolution can happen: natural selection, gene flow, genetic drift, and sexual selection. They all contribute to evolution in pretty unique ways, but they all contribute to the changing of alleles and genetics. So make sure you take notes and respond to them, and then you'll have one more quick set of problems for Hardy-Weinberg to do before we see each other on Tuesday and Wednesday. Thanks, y'all.